A while back, we built a compact work area that's meant to take up one wall of a standard garage. I call it the one wall workshop, and I will make a full video about it and some plans for those who want to build it down the road, probably sometime this winter. When that happens, I'll link to those plans below this video, so if you're watching it after that happened, check those out. This video, though, is about a homemade vise that I designed for the flip-up workbench portion of that. It's called a wagon vise, and it's a traditional way to secure project parts flat on a bench top so you can cut or route or sand or drill or chop or whatever you need to do without things moving around on you. There are a lot of different ways to make a wagon vise, and I'm not saying mine is the best by any means. In fact, it was sort of an experiment that I think turned out really well. So in this video, I'll show you how it came about, and you can either copy it as it is, or just use some of the ideas to design and build your own version. Either way, I think you're going to find this really interesting. It started with some 3 3/4 inch wide strips of 3/4 inch thick oak laminated together. These are wider than the finished vise required, but for alignment purposes and clamping, it's just easier to make them oversized at the start. After the glue dries, they're trimmed down to their final width of 3.5 inches. That evens out and squares up the edges at the same time. Then 1/2 inch deep, 3/4 inch wide grooves are plowed right down the center of each edge. Next, a 3/4 inch dog hole is bored in the center, 1.5 inches from the end. A drill press was the best tool for this job because it had to be nice and straight. The whole assembly was also made about 8 inches longer than the bench itself, so I had a little extra to use for other purposes, including a 3-inch segment, which incorporated that hole, and another 2-inch segment, which was trimmed off. While the drill press was still set up, a full row of dog holes was bored down the remaining length. We spaced them 3 inches apart, and they go all the way through. Remember that 2-inch segment? Well, it needs a hole in its center. End grain can be hard to drill, so a sharp Forstner bit was used, and the workpiece was secured with more than just a hand grip. Now I know what you're thinking. What size is that hole? Well, that depends on what you use for your clamping mechanism, and this is where it got interesting. I had a veneer screw, much like this one, laying around my shop for years, and that's why I decided to use to make my vise, because it's relatively inexpensive. I'll link to one below this video if you want to do the same thing. Unfortunately, I don't have any footage of actually attaching it. I don't know what happened to that video, so we're going to have to improvise. I'll explain it the best I can. The veneer screw comes apart in 3 pieces. There's a little set screw at the end that, once removed, releases the foot from the threaded shaft. Then the movable flange can be twisted off the shaft as well. That flange is what slips inside the hole that we bored in that end grain. Now it's slightly tapered, so the hole has to be sized to its widest diameter. You don't want to create a wedge that splits the end grain when you pound it in an overly tight hole. Now once it's in, 2 screws are driven through the tabs to secure it in place. This footage was taken after everything was assembled, but you can see one of the screws through one of the tabs on the top. During use, all the pressure will be toward the block of wood, essentially pressing the flange deeper into its hole, so the screws are not going to rip out. The foot portion of our screw assembly will be attached to the center of that 3-inch segment. No hole through the wood is needed here. Instead, a small pilot hole is drilled inside the foot through the cast iron. Then a screw is threaded in to attach it to the block of wood. A little filing was also done to the edges of the foot because it was slightly oversized. Again, during use, all the pressure will be toward the wood block. The foot is not going to pull away from the screw holding it in place. To create the tracking mechanism, 3/4 inch strips of oak are used as rails. Here you see the first one being aligned with 2 stationary portions of the vise. We have the 2-inch block with its threaded flange, and the longer section with its multiple dog holes. Brad nails were used to hold the strip to the faceboard, then screws were added for a more permanent connection. The bench that this vise will be attached to is simply a 2x4 frame with a hardwood top. It's small, but it's built for a confined space. Remember, this idea is scalable to any bench of any size. You'll see what I mean later, but for now, just imagine this is being attached to the front of a larger bench. With one rail attached to the bench itself, the other is now attached in a similar way to another faceboard. The same vise components are used to align that 3/4 inch rail as it's temporarily secured with nails, then screws. Note that this faceboard has another piece attached on the end in an L shape. This part is going to wrap around the end of the bench top. It's connected with a single dovetail joint because this joint may be stressed a bit when the vise is tightened. Notice that there's also a hole through the end panel for the vise screw's shaft to pass through once it's installed. Before the final assembly, all the sharp edges of the movable footblock are sanded so it'll slide freely in the wooden track. Now the flange block is glued in place on the wooden track in the corner of the L. The long portion with all the dog holes in it is also glued in place. There's a 9-inch space between these two. These parts are not intended to move on that track. They were built as if they would because that makes everything easier to get all aligned. But now the glue locks them in place permanently, and only a 9-inch section of open track is remaining for the movable portion of the vise. Before everything is attached to the other track on the front edge of the bench top, that movable footblock is set in place without glue. Then the final assembly is completed. An end cap is attached to the other end of the bench top, giving the appearance of solid oak. The vise screw can now be inserted, and it's done. I prefer to leave my bench tops unfinished so they aren't slippery, but that's just a personal preference. As I explained, this small bench is intended to hinge down to save space, but it could be made larger. In fact, this vise could be attached to the front of just about any bench. You don't need a longer screw or a longer gap where that movable block slides. You just need a longer end portion, the stationary portion where all the dog holes are. Make that longer and add more holes to make it the full length of whatever bench you're attaching it to. When I do make plans for the one-wall workshop, I'll include plans for this vise, but I did just show you how to build it, and you might even modify it for your own use. But before you do, check this out. Ridge Carbide is the best kept secret in woodworking. I kid you not, their saw blades are second to none, both in quality and performance, and they're less expensive than the other ultra premium brands. Do yourself a favor, use the link and the discount code below this video. You will never go back to cheap blades again.